Hello to all of you. It's the beginning of our week 10, and I want to present to you our Week 10 presentation regarding cost management and best practices. First, I want to recap a bit and put things in perspective or make sure that we've got the linkage and the connection from week to week. Our course is earned value management and then how its focus is on cost control and earned value management. We then looked at pricing and trade-off analysis for make-buy and getting involved in procurement. Many project managers have internal projects that they work with, and not often do they seriously get involved in procurement. But today, with the specialization in different businesses and business-to-business relationships, the use of outside labor consultants, temporary labor, virtual teams, procurement and purchasing is getting to be more and more a central part of the toolkit that a project manager has to have their hands on. We did take a look in week 6 we were talking about trade-off analysis, went into procurement and solicitations, RFPs, types of contracts. We went into cost management analysis where we went into that deeper. In 9 and 8 we were talking about our contracts, legal perspectives, what constitutes a contract, talking about negotiations last week, cost management analysis. This week we're going to pick that up and take it a step further, but we're also going to sort of wrap up our attention on procurement and working in procurement from project perspective. And then in week 11, we're going to go back and look at the whole situation of cost management from a graphics point of view with some ideas how we might present many of the analyses and many of the picture, the condition of our project and its financial status. And then finally, week 12, we're going to have our final examination. So here we are at the 75% mark, gone through our project, and I wanted to make sure that we had this recap because all of these courses are connected and all of them have a linkage that is very important for you and for me as a project manager, for all of us to make sure we have a really good, fine understanding of it. Maybe we don't stay current in it because we're not using it in our particular projects, but we need to know where we can go and look, what we need to know. We need to be able to go back and we need to realize what it is we don't know or we need support on. The situation of projects and contracts and procurement issues are very, very significant and is one of the biggest places that as a project manager we can make some tremendous errors. And most of the errors come in two places. They impact our schedules adversely and they impact our costs adversely. Based on that, I want to move forward now into week 10, talking a little bit about our organizational structure. One of the things that you can tell about your organization and how it's structured, it'll tell you how significant is purchasing to the business model or the business engine. What is the overall black box function of your corporation? You know, the inputs, the outputs. What does everybody do? What does every functional organization in there contribute to the success of the organization? And by how purchasing is organized, how large it is, what type of skill sets are in there, what kind of work they do, whether they do their own negotiating or subcontracts, you really can tell a lot about the importance of purchasing to your firm. And when you think about materials availability or the dollar volume of purchases, you're going to find out that it could be pretty significant to your overall cost of doing business in the course of a fiscal year for your company. Another aspect of it is depending on what you're doing. You might be in a service business where you don't really buy very many materials. It might also tell you that if you do buy a lot of materials or end products that you adapt or ship on to your customers or use internally, it'll give you a sense that when you're looking at your project costs and looking at your cost estimates and how you're going to manage costs, the percent of materials that you're using relative to your total cost of the project can give you some significant insight into how good your monitoring and control tools need to be to monitor what's happening in the procurement area of your project. And also the amount of influence that the firm has over materials availability. If you're in a large firm and you got significant procurement activities going on, buying materials or services, you will probably have a lot of influence on your vendors and your subcontractors. Conversely, if there isn't very much that you're buying or using, then you probably are going to have to stand in line with every other potential customer to a vendor and be treated as just one of the many that they do business with. Again, I want to bring back our focus to procurement on projects. The significance of purchasing on a project success. If you have purchasing involved in your project, the influence is probably very, very significant. But it does depend on the type of project and what your scope of work is, what your statement of work is, what your deliverables are, how it's going to impact the performance, cost, and scheduling. If you're doing subcontracting where a major portion of your project or your work breakdown structure is actually goes out the door in a cost in a subcontract, then it may have an influence over you where it's almost like the tail is wagging the dog, and you need to make sure you understand the significance of the relationships and the influence and how procurement actually is involved. And this is from a strategic point of view and a tactical point of view. Remember, I made a comment about you need to know the de jure and the de facto organizational structure in your company. You need to know who the shakers and movers are. Who are the go-to people that you go to get things done? And this is the same thing with procurement. Depending on how procurement is involved in your organization, how significant it is, or how involved it is in your project, it may make a big difference. And one point is that possibly you only have one small procurement action in your whole project. But if that were to turn upside down and not do well, it could significantly impact your project. And it also is the fact that you only have this little procurement activity going on in your project. You may not get a lot of attention from procurement because they got a lot of other things working. Significant, a lot more dollar value, a lot more involvement, but still you got to figure out how are you going to get attention paid to you so that your procurement action can come off within cost and schedule as well. So there's got to be a lot of knowledge and understanding. You've got to be cognizant of how the organization works. What is your level of experience? Are you knowledgeable enough, or is there somebody you can go to, another project manager or someone you can go to get that existing information? And you need to know how your organization structure works regarding all its buying policies. And this also leads us to what I call cross-functional coordination. We may work with another department, even though we're a project. We may work with another department in a procurement action because that department has the bulk of the subject matter experts that are going to be used on our project with whatever it is that we're buying. So your structure, your organizational structure really requires very significant understanding. When we're talking about procurement, it's the same thing as when we're thinking about make-buy, because make-buy could be looked at as whether you do it internally or externally. Well, you got the same kind of decision when you're talking about between two vendors, or are you really going to go outside? Maybe it is more significant for you to just subcontract the whole thing out there, or maybe you can buy it commercially, or maybe what you do is you bring in some skill sets and set up a project-oriented function which is going to do the same thing as what you'd buy outside. So these are the kind of things that you need to consider and be able to really get your arms around and understand and make very intelligent business-based decisions. So some of the things you want to consider when you're with procurement is the first thing that I think about is depending on the size of the project, the duration of the relationship with purchasing or procurement, do I want to have on the project staff an expediter or someone that is very familiar with buying and with the purchasing? Do I want to see if I can get from the procurement organization somebody assigned on a full-time basis that really will pay attention to the project's needs over a special period of time? Maybe I only have that one procurement action, but is it significant enough that maybe I want to try to get somebody from procurement for the period that I need them for that action? So you need to really have a good sense of what is the relationship, what are the dynamics here, because when we deal with purchasing, we're doing it because we want to work with somebody outside the company. And when we want to work with someone outside the company, we cannot lose sight of the process requirements it takes, the loops we have to run through, the gates we got to go through, going from our project office out to a vendor and then all the way back in, bringing in services or material. We've got to have this perspective, this bigger picture, because this will set up the dynamics and the strategy of how we deal and how we plan this in our project. It affects our leverage. It affects our resource loading in the organizations, the lifespan of the project. All these things got to be considered when we are talking about being involved with our project, with purchasing and with a procurement action. Not trying to make too much of it, but I don't want to make light of it either. And especially for many of you that may not have project experience yet with procurement or procurement actions or heavy procurements where you're going out competitive bids to get a subcontractor or something like that, you need to be aware of the homework you need to do before you get involved in that, and especially when you're planning your project. For instance, here's a layout. There's two strategies here. One on the top is before MRP implementation and one is after. MRP is a materials requirements planning system. It started out in 1990 by Gartner, and it was called ERP, which was really enterprise requirements planning. It went to material requirements, and then it came back to ERP, where once again it's enterprise resource planning systems. And when it gets to be this large a system, ERP, we're really talking about total integration of the company, where all of your suppliers, all of your materials, all of your internal processes, all your deliveries, your installations, implementations, your maintenance of your customer after you have delivered whatever it is, system services or whatever, how you modify that, upgrades, all those type of things are all managed in this ERP system. It's not managed by the system. Managers manage it, project managers manage it, people manage it, okay? But the ERP package is like a package. It's a large software that can handle our inventory, work in process. It tells us how much cash we got tied up. It has our bills of materials on materials. It has our resource inventories in it. It is really quite an extensive system that is very, very important to an organization. Going back to the top section, before MRP implementation, before we had the capability to have that kind of automated visibility that we could look at every part of the process, what would happen is most often we'd have a scheduler that would work in for a project or worked in purchasing, and we'd bring our purchase request to a scheduler. It would go through the purchasing to a buyer. A buyer would then go talk to the sales organization and the vendor. They'd go to a scheduler, find out what they had available, where it was, when they could deliver it. They'd come back and they'd go through all the processes, putting a contract or a purchase order together. But everything had to loop from the scheduler through purchasing, through sales, back to the scheduler. And the scheduler is really like the hands-on person in those organizations. Once you take your purchase request and sign off on it as a project manager, you take it to purchasing and you put it in the inbox or whatever they do, and then they start looking at them. It's a scheduler that gets it and then starts scheduling it and gets set up with buyers, and they determine whether or not they got to do competitive bidding or they can just go to an open source procurement activity. After we had MRP and we matured and had a better sense of procurement action, and there was a lot more procurement actions, and also customers, especially it started out with the government, but now it's in the commercial area too. The customers decided that they wanted to have a contractual relationship in place, but they didn't want to limit themselves and try to figure out how much of whatever it is or what kind of products or what kind of quantities they needed for a whole year and put that in the contract, or go through putting contracts together every time they wanted to buy something. So they came up with the concept of what they called an indefinite quantity contract. And basically that comes up with general terms and conditions and prices and quantities on all the different things that one company may want to buy from another company. But it does not have a limit on the quantities, either in a maximum or a minimum. The beauty of this was that once this contract is put in place, you don't have to go through the chain of purchasing to sales to a scheduler and back and forth and all that. The schedulers could talk directly to each other, and you cut out a great deal of lead time in trying to get an order placed and get a quantity into your company, into your receiving inspection, so that you could use it in your project team. The benefit of really having MRP system and having this type of automated inventory, automated work in process, cost basis system, it's really a complete system, resource system that a lot of companies use. Not all of them. There's many companies, small companies, that don't really put ERP in place, but they still may be affected. They may be on the receiving end as a supplier on an indefinite quantity contract. And I just wanted to show you these two relationships to show you that today in our supply chain, in our procurement activities, in our overall procurement actions, and in our projects, that we need to understand these type things too, because we may have to use them, implement them, or work on them. And especially, you may not want to look today at whatever project you're running or something like that, but look at your career and look at your career growth. My first project that I ever had was only a few $100,000. It really wasn't very many years before I had projects in the millions and in tens of millions, and not much later than that when it was in the hundreds of millions and over multiple periods of years. And that's the growth in our career as project managers, especially we move around a little bit, different industries, things of that nature, and we really need to have a sense for what's going on. It's our professional capability, our professional competence that we're able to understand these things and go back and do them. We also need to think about, when we're talking about procurement and talking about the things we did now, is cross-functional teams. Sometimes we have to bring in teams that are cross-functional in the sense of how they help each other and how they support each other, or provide a subject matter excellence and expertise to what we're trying to do. And we also can be working with customers, or even in our own company, whether we have decentralized or centralized plants, and we need to look at how we will work with our project teams. How can we take the best advantage of the resources and the capabilities of our firm and our vendors and our customers' firms to really do the best, most efficient, productive delivery of a project. Sometimes we have projects, and there's a lot of projects involving new product development, especially the way technology is developing over the last 10, 15 years, and with things like Silicon Valley, things are just jumping up all over the place. New product development is coming all the time. We also need to get involved. We may not have any product or manufacturing capability today, but we may be involved with a project that has a relationship to that, either by a vendor or by a customer, and we need to have a sense of exactly understanding how that kind of environment works and what we need to consider when we're talking about projects and development projects, and whether we're talking about agile or we're talking about traditional project methodology or we're talking about concurrent engineering, whatever we're talking about. So the standard operating practice today is collaboration between organizations, within projects to optimize the system. There may be cases, I've had them in my experience, where I worked very close with another project manager in the firm who had a different customer and doing a different task, different work, different situation, different scope, different goal. However, we shared an interest in certain key subject matter experts, and so we would work together collaboratively to make sure that we can both get the benefit that we needed without negatively impacting our project. And so those are the dynamics that we work in. When we talk about early involvement, if we can get the people involved early enough before we need them, in a sense, they can have a chance to understand what's coming and prepare for it. Even though you're not ready to buy or you're not ready to let a contract, by having your purchasing department and some suppliers involved, it can help in doing some of the definition work. It could even help in the front end planning work. You could bring suppliers in and not necessarily committing to giving them a procurement, but you could bring them in if they wanted to be involved in it, have them sign a confidentiality agreement so they wouldn't disclose what's going on. You might bring them in, solicit from them information about procurement, how they would prefer to see a procurement action when our project got to that point of view. And they might be able to help what kind of information we might put in any specifications that we were going to sublet, what kind of material, standardization, what kind of testing would be done, what kind of delivery, whether or not if we had any kind of production, what would be the best way to do some of the process control or capital equipment, what would motivate our suppliers and the purchasing department and the other project people to work closer together and to make this project a successful project. So when we talk about EPI, we're really talking about early purchasing involvement. Often if we're doing concurrent engineering, that involves a purchasing function early. But at times, when you're just defining the project and getting ready to lay down some of the groundwork in the project and planning, and you might invite somebody from purchasing in, I will tell you this: if you consider organizations like purchasing and finance, organizations that you don't necessarily have involved in your project every day, if you invite them in to sit in a meeting or listen or make a contribution or listen to them if they have something to say, you would be surprised how much cooperation and support you'll get from them, because they feel, in a sense, privileged, because not every project does it, and they will also feel like they're there and you appreciate their value, so they're going to stand up and help you and work for you and give you good information. In this kind of sense, it's like you're letting somebody know they have value, you're inviting them in when you probably didn't have to, but in truth you did have to, because if you're really trying to have a very successful project, you want any input they can contribute. It could be very key to what's going on. And that's the same kind of thing for early supplier involvement, ESI, because then through EPI, bringing procurement in, we can also include some of the outside vendors in the process. We could talk about pre-qualifying suppliers, have some suppliers come in and we could start identifying them and looking at them, surveying them. We could also see maybe, oh boy, we may not want to do business with this supplier because they think they really have some good technological expertise, but they're not as far along as these other guys we've been talking to. What kind of capability are they? Do they have good management? Is it a sweatshop, or is it well managed? Are the people that work there happy, content? Are they hustling? We can take a good look at the competition between the the suppliers, or we can use an existing supplier. It gives us great insight too for our contract management plan. And when we start taking a look at some of the costs and some of the percentage of costs, these are a few facts that are just absolutely true and that you really need to keep in the back of your mind. Anytime we're in a design phase or a synergy phase where we're putting something together, whether it's a system or a service, or we're deciding how it's going to work, processes or things of that nature up front, or an actual design of a product or a system, at the time we're actually doing that design phase, 80% of the total cost, it becomes fixed at that point by what we decided to buy, what we're going to do internally, by materials, and by the other types of things that we do. We are actually fixing the cost that we're going to wind up having to spend for whatever it is, that product or service that we're going to deliver. The other 20%, and these are statistics across a lot of industries, and mostly this is national U.S. kind of information, but there's a lot of data in here too that's international. So 20% of the cost can be affected by source selection, pricing, contract management, things that we were talking about earlier a few weeks ago. In the design phase, in that front end, right around project planning, right when the first activities are really kicked off in the project, we have a huge ability to influence a major portion of the total cost. There's still a significant 1/5% of that cost can be affected by how we deal with source selection, pricing, but fundamentally we're talking contract management. When we take a look at design, what should we have a supplier design? What should we have them do? What should we get them involved in? How much of it should we put outside? Many of you already probably are exposed to them in one way or another. It may not be a jet engine, but it could be a power engine for some piece of equipment. It could be as simple as a pump, dewatering, okay? And where is your key suppliers? Is it better to have some of your key suppliers come in and work with your designers, or maybe have some of your designers work with the suppliers? What kind of performance can you improve, or how can you make sure that you get the right quality and keep that cost down? If you bring these people in and work, you got a chance to optimize the performance and the productivity of both sides, in a sense that you're getting the best solution for what you're trying to accomplish, and maybe a good cost-effective solution. And by that close communication, you sure are going to be able to shorten that section of your project and have a much more reliable schedule if you got people that are really working together. When we're talking about the purchase descriptions, how are we going to go out for a procurement? What are we going to put on the purchase rec? What kind of specs are we going to write? What kind of statement of work are we going to write? What kind of lead time are we going to ask for? What are we going to ask for, and how, in looking at the key personnel that a supplier is going to use? What are we going to talk about regarding their total quality, in the sense, and when I say total quality, I'm talking about everything from how the phone calls are answered by our opposite numbers, project managers in the vendor community, what's going on in the quality of the reports. It isn't just quality of a product. It isn't just something inspect. Quality is every bit of work and contribution everybody on the team makes. And that's not just the project team. The quality of the performance of your procurement organization can affect your project. The quality and performance of your finance organization affects it. The quality and performance of your executives, of your HR department, of your IT department, of your facilities. Everyone contributes to the performance, the productivity, and efficiency of an organization, and to what comes out the door. What are you delivering? I can't say that strong enough or make enough emphasis of it, because I've seen it too often, and I've seen where one organization deep in the bowels of a company could really create a problem for a lot of projects that normally don't have anything to do with that organization. Communicate. We want to really make sure we do a good job communicating, taking what I was just talking about, the statement of works, the specifications and all that. How well do we communicate to the purchaser, to the supplier? Have we brought them in early involvement, like we said? Do they have a good sense of what we're coming up with, what we're trying to do? What kind of standards are we going to use? How are we going to make sure that we have conformance of whatever the design or the service or the product or the parts? How are we going to make sure that they are really well certified and that they really will provide us with the performance and the reliability we need for us to be successful on our projects and our deliveries? Usually when you start to talk about detailed specifications or requirements or performance or processes, whether it's a service or a product, a piece of equipment, whatever it is, those are locked in on that front end. That's where that 80% is, remember? So how do we do that? How do we make sure that we have the right specifications and that they're locked in, that they're well understood, and they can be delivered to? We don't want to specify something that can't be delivered, but we also need to make sure that whatever we specify can be, one, delivered, two, it will work and is totally compatible compatible and integratable with whatever we're doing, and it goes to our customer. The customer is going to have satisfaction with it too. Almost like we're going back the loop now, and I'm talking about cross-functional input, talking about how do these things work together. The fact that we have certain functional requirements, are they competing? Are they compatible? How well will they work together? What impact will they have on the cost of a system? These are the type of things that need to be thought about by your subject matter experts when they're doing that portion of the project, and by your vendors and by any subcontractors. However, you got to make sure that you bring it to their attention so that they consider it and that they do work to have an optimal delivered system. Just in final comment on this slide, the last item, arbitrary tolerance decisions. We can't really tolerate that. What we need to do is make sure that if we're going to make any kind of decisions regarding production or quality or the service or how, for instance, a decision might be a specification. What we're putting together is a customer service system. We're writing software to put into some computers or mainframes. One of the specifications that we put in there is that it's okay for if a customer service operator presses enter, in worst case, the screen doesn't change for 2 seconds. That might be totally intolerable. However, if we were to say that the screen has got to change and respond within a quarter of a second or a tenth of a second, that might be absolutely way too tight, and that's going to be a high performance specification, so you know that's going to cost money to make sure our system will respond in that type of time frame. So when we talk about these detailed specs, we can look at what kind of standards we want to use or how do we want to write the specifications. The best way, the preferred way, is if we can use commercial standards. And one of the things about commercial standards is the fact that most all firms understand them. Most all skilled subject matter experts in those applied fields understand them, and they are achievable. We're not asking for something that's specially priced or specially developed that's going to be very expensive and hard to make. We want to make sure that we have good design specifications, either with drawings or however we write it. We could have design specifications that go along with algorithms if we're putting software code together. We want to make sure that we understand what kind of methodology is going to be used in the manufacturing of a product, or what is a vendor going to do if they're going to provide a service to us. The vendor may just be making user manuals for you, so you just need to make sure that you're thinking clearly about what your costs are and making sure that in your specifications, what you really need to do, it's very simple. If you think of performance specifications, you got to think of the form, fit, and function. Focus on that, whether it's a service, whether it's a product, whatever it is you're delivering. Form, fit, and function. And also, you want to make sure your specifications discuss what, not how. You don't want to tell your vendor or even another department in the organization, or you don't want to tell somebody else how to do their job. What you want to tell them is what you need. Let them use the best way to figure out how. And you want to make sure that in your performance specifications, you're thinking about your supplier's core competence. Can they really deliver it? Is this doable? Is this doable on a reasonable basis, or is this a very expensive basis? What kind of design? If we talk about any kind of modular design, or where we put it like in functional, in the sense that you would take a section of a WBS and give a different section to each suppliers, you might find that you could get some fair comparisons from your suppliers and make some good evaluations when you're doing your supplier selection or you're reviewing their proposals. Is the supplier responsible for the design and build? That's going to add a liability to the supplier, which is going to increase the cost. Or are you providing the design to the supplier and they're just going to build it to the specifications and designs that are provided to them? In every event, the selection of the suppliers are very, very critical. And you can see from what we've been discussing, if you go back and think about what I said in the beginning of this discussion today, you can see how we need to make sure that we don't take this too lightly. Other type specifications we might get involved in is by selecting something by a brand name or a trade name. We can sometimes reduce prices by selecting something by brand or trade names. And often when we use terms like give me Motorola or equal, or you can say equal or better. In other words, you don't want anything less than trade name you're calling out, but it could be better. However, if it's better, you want to make sure that you're not paying a premium for better. You want to make sure you're at least or equal. You want to stay as close to equal as you can. When we have samples, and the suppliers love to give us samples, they love to get us involved and hooked and talking about it. They like us to like their samples, because then maybe the designers, the developers, they're going to select them because they like the sample or whatever. But it is really, in final analysis, it's really difficult to evaluate a supplier just by a sample. A sample gives you a sense and an idea of what it is and how it's going to look in the form, fit, or function of what they're giving you in that sample. But is that sample really representative of what you need from that supplier? And there's also grades of quality that can be defined in industry standards by the different precisions and specifications that we can sense. When we talk about standardization, the point I want to make about standardization is if we can specify something that's already a standard in industry, we have an opportunity to get down to a very reasonable competitive pricing, and we also have an opportunity to get the most vendors involved, which guarantees us a pretty competitive pricing, a decent selection so we can select a good vendor to provide us with whatever we're doing. Standardizations, they plan, do, check, act in the sense that we say standardize, do, check, act, same thing. And the one thing about standardization, it means that we're going to have less variation in whatever it is we're buying, but it doesn't mean we're having less freedom to improve it. We're saying it's just going to be a lot closer to what it is we're requiring based on the specifications. And by going to standardization, if we can buy something which is a standard product or a standard part, standard service, or a standard computer, we will be able to get lower prices, we'll be able to get lower costs, and usually the quality will be higher because the production of those devices and those services are at a higher rate. So they work them out and become more productive, more efficient, and the functionality is usually a lot more solid. And finally, if we take a look at some of the sources of our standards, there's the international standards such as ISO 9000 and AS 9000. I'm sure you're familiar with ISO 9000. That's a standardization that we talked about before regarding the fact that if we want to sell overseas to the EU requires all vendors to be ISO 9000 certified, or you cannot even sell anything into Europe. There's also industrial standards like the IEEE or the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. You got government mil specs. I don't know if any of you have seen mil specs yet. I'd love to send you one or two. They are the most detailed things, and you really can say there's only a government that can do something like this. Then we have the national standards, ANSI, which actually I've seen ANSI. The first place I ever run into ANSI was in screw threads, whether they're machine threads or machine screw threads or nuts or whatever. And then finally, at the lowest end of that hierarchy of standards, we have our own company standards, whatever our drawing standards are, our process, what do we call standard parts, how do we specify these things. Just in closing a little bit, talking about if we really want to go sourcing and we decide we need to go international, there's 6 reasons when we might go international, or at least a minimum of 6, whether we go with it for quality, for cost, for schedule. So one of the reasons we can go global is quality or cost, schedule, technology. If we want to broaden our supplier base, in other words, get more suppliers qualified, or maybe it's part of a project where we have to deliver something overseas, and one of the stipulations in the contract requires that counter trade. We're building things here, but we got to have a subcontractor in that country or in that area so that they can get some industrial development working too. And there's also a lot of different risk factors when we go international. And one of the biggest ones is we're not sure how their contract law really works, or how well we would be treated as a foreign company if we had to go to a court in a foreign land, try to get some kind of redress for some issue, or if we were pulled into a foreign court. And there might be a greater reward if we go international. Those are all factors that are a little bit abstract, and we need to take them on a case-by-case basis. Some of the potential problems on international is the cultural differences. We may not really appreciate how people converse with each other, how we communicate with each other. We may not be aware enough to the sensitivities of the different cultures, and we may make some faux pas and make some mistakes. We may have mistakes made to us. So there's things that are potential problems. And our communications and understanding, idiomatic phrases, local dialects, we forget quite often when we're speaking, when we're overseas. If we speak with somebody who speaks our common language, we've hit like a home run because we can communicate now. But they may not appreciate some of the words and vocabulary and phrases we use because we fall into them because it's really not good English, but rather it's idiomatic. And then we also have local dialect situation. Currency fluctuations, we can get into a lot more trouble in lead times due to potential customs, export licenses, transportation. Is it going to come by ship, by air? How's it going to get here? If there's strikes in the other country or on our own docks, longshoremen strikes, what is it if it flies in? What's the transportation cost going to be? Lots of different things can really affect the international procurement when we're talking about potential problems. And then we have quality, and if we have to get a corrective action, if we have a part that's defective, what is it going to take for us to get that defective part replaced? And then there's also overhead costs and time zones and translators, all the other things that you need to get involved in when you're working international. And also when we work international, a lot of countries have a practice where they want you to work through an intermediary. You might get a representative over there who knows how to work with a company, or at least they profess to know. And you're really not going to get a lot of attention from anybody unless you have somebody locally in that country that can open doors for you, has contacts, can make calls, get you in, and advise you on the way you need to walk forward in your business dealings so that you can come to a successful conclusion. And then there's also a lot of risk to that too. Is the intermediary just setting you up because they're really closely in lockstep with the customer or the vendor that you're dealing with internationally? There's a lot of unknowns when you're working internationally. When you're talking about your cost and price, okay, what is the total price going to be, or what is the total cost going to be? And so they really need to do a lot of careful analysis on how you're going to work that. That whatever your deals you're arranging, whether or not if something's being shipped to you or you're shipping something, whether or not it's on the munitions list, whether the Department of State will give you a license, whether you even need an export license, or whether you got to go to Commerce for a license. The U.S. isn't the best place in the world to have a straightforward way of doing business overseas either. And then there's other international channels. You can have a international procurement office. One of the things I really liked when I worked with Magnavox for over 15 years, and I was doing a lot of international business in my employment with them. And we had a office over in Switzerland called Magnavox Overseas Limited, which was really a registered corporate office over there for our international business. And by having that office set up, there was only a few people there. I was able to do a lot more effective business arrangements and deals by working through that office than working directly from my office in Southern California. For time zones, for customs, the way people, when I say customs, I'm talking about the cultural issues, and the people that staffed that office over there was a lot more familiar with doing business in Europe and the Middle East, in the areas where I was doing business. It was a great boon to me and a great help to have those people there and have them involved in what was going on. Direct purchasing, there's how do you qualify international suppliers? A lot of significant differences. As a final subject, consider the learning curve, meaning that when you're doing a repetitive task, you can improve it because you get more familiar with it. This actually became observed and known and defined and trusted and implemented in production and in manufacturing organizations where you're building a lot of the same parts or a lot of the same planes or the same radios or whatever. There is a phenomenon called a learning curve, and that is that every time you do the same thing as you just did, you have an improvement in time. Your performance, your productivity improves every time the task is repeated. What is really interesting about it is that every time the output doubles, there's a predictable reduction or decrease in the worker's hours required, and that's a fixed percentage. So in other words, if you had a person make 2 of something and then they made 4 of something, you would see an improvement, and you could figure out what that percentage improvement was. If they did 4 and then they did 8, that they doubled it, you would see the same percentage improvement. And then if they went from 8 to 16, you would see the same percentage improvement. As project managers, we don't often, very seldom, get involved in learning curves or the learning rates or anything, a learning curve kind of consideration. But sometimes we have projects where there is a repetitive activity going on, and it doesn't need to be making a product or putting something together. It could be paperwork, writing reports, or writing certain documents. If it's a repetitive process, the project manager should be familiar enough with the learning curve to take it into account when we're talking about the amount of productivity we get and what the duration of some task might be. This is one way of showing the improvement in units of time, how there's an improvement every time the quantities change. And then when you double the quantity, you get that improvement. And this doesn't really point that out to you, but I show you this curve because it's a traditional curve that's used. What I want to do is show you this one. And this is on an Excel spreadsheet. And if you look at week 10, where you had to start running this presentation, right underneath it is an Excel spreadsheet that you can click on and download, and it has this exact information on it. It's set up to give you a learning curve regression calculation. If you set up it says the regression of actual performance. This is a learning curve is an 80% curve, which means that every time you double the quantity, you're going to improve. You're only going to use 80% of the time you did on the previous. For instance, looking at that little table there, there's unit number 2. Unit number 2 is actually going to cost us $600,000. That's the cost per unit. That's the actual cost, so that would be our predicted cost. If we doubled that, and instead of making 2 of them, we got to 4. The fourth one would cost us 80% of what the second one did. So 80% of 600,000 is 480,000. So you can see there's a significant improvement there. And then also, if we continued to make them when we got to the eighth one would cost us 80% of what the fourth one did. So you multiply the 480,000 by 80%, that's 384. Well, this can go on, and you can predict this. 16, it's down to 307. At 32, it's 245. You can take it over and over again. This Excel spreadsheet, you can set up the learning curve you want and the quantities you want, and then you can see what the calculations are, and you can see how this works. And it's interesting to play around with it a little bit so you get a certain familiarity with it, and then at least you hang on to it and you can come back to it if you get in a situation where a learning curve may be something that you want to consider in your project. Looking at the chart now, the red line is a plot of what the unit cost is doing as you come down through these quantities every time you double it. And what I've done is I've taken a straight line linear approximation and I used that out of Excel and just let it plot on there. However, you can highlight, put your cursor on that straight line and light it, and you can right click and you can change whether you want to do a linear approximation or whether you want to do a power approximation or an exponential. I'm not going to tell you which one it is. If you change that a couple times, you'll find one that puts that black line right on top of the red line, and it's just a perfect approximation for this learning curve. I'm not going to give that away. I'm just going to let you do that. But if anybody has any problem with this or has any questions, let me know. But this is in that Excel spreadsheet that's right underneath the same place that you activated this video. Finally, I want to spend a moment with you on a very significant element in your planning. This is a model to consider when you're doing your estimation of labor, when you are deciding the duration of a task and how much resources and the work that it takes, how long will it take. This is a simple estimating labor approximation sheet giving you some examples. And the first line, if we look at the first line where L equals D, what that is basically saying is that how many hours of labor or production will I actually get for 100% efficiency? And you'll see that 10 hours of labor crosses 10 hours of duration, and that's perfect. That's 100%. So in other words, if somebody works for 10 hours or 10 days, I will get 10 units of labor from them, exactly what it is they put in. So it's 100% efficient. Let's take a look at if an individual is 75% efficient. In other words, if they work 40 hours, I'm only going to get 30 hours of work out of them. That's the next line down. You can see that one if you go to 10 and go up to where you intersect it with that next line. You'll see to the left that goes to 8, meaning that you have 75% efficient, okay? Or actually 75. And so that's a 75%. The third line, which has like the step function in it, the one I want you to spend some time thinking about, because it's almost the kind of line that we have in the real world. I get in the morning and I sit down and I start work, and I'm going right up the slope, doing good work and all that. Then I get a phone call or I get a distraction, and I may lose an hour or two, and then I get back to work, and then somebody walks in and asks me a question or needs to talk to me, so then I lose, and then I get back to work, and then there's another interruption after about 13 hours, and so I lose an hour and a half. Do you see how the effective slope of my production productivity is affected. If I was trying to do 10 hours worth of work under the first situation, I could do it in 10 hours. In the second situation, if I was trying to do 10 hours worth of work, it would take me a lot longer than that because I'd only be performing 75% efficient. If I had a lot of interruptions, it might take me 20 hours to do 10 hours worth of work, which means I'm only 50% effective. Some companies have actual standards. They say when you're doing scheduling, estimate your labor at 75% efficient or 80% efficient, 90% efficient. I hope not 60 or anything lower than that. The standards over a number of years, they used to announce the standards on a monthly basis, what the productivity of the workforce of the United States was for the previous month. And we used to run for a number of years around 77%, 75, 78%. And then in the early 90s, it really improved. It actually went up into the 80s and low 80s, 85, and it was getting a lot better. And then we had a couple of those crashes, and that's when everything really started to fall apart. And when the crashes are over, and a lot of our employers and a lot of companies don't want to rehire right away, what they do is they work hard to get that efficiency up. They try to do 5 people's worth of work with 3 people because they don't want to hire the other 2 back because cost is too high based on the way business is going. And so we find out that every time we go through a traumatic period, we find out new ways of doing processes, new ways of getting the work done, and new ways of increasing our productivity. And the result is we don't necessarily always bring the whole labor force back into the plant or back into the company. Even while that's all interesting, what's important to you and to me is that when I have a 40-hour task and I need to schedule that, can I schedule that in a 40-hour week? Or do I have to schedule that in 6 working days, which is actually going to give me a 56-hour week? Or maybe schedule it over a course of 8 days, which is 64 hours. Good information here. I want you to really stay on top of that, understand it, and if you have any questions about it, let me know. Thank you for your time today. Thank you for working with me. Thank you for this week. You're all doing very well. I really enjoy the cases you're working on. I enjoy the dialogue, the discussions going back and forth. You're doing great work. We got 2 more weeks to go and 1 more week with the actual work, and then we got our final examination. I know you're going to do great on that. It's been a pleasure for me to be working with each and every one of you this quarter, and I wish you all the very best of everything. You take care, and you have a great day.